Lots of exterior materials for a home. Lap siding's the most probably common, or batten board. We're looking at a house that we're building with stucco. You know, stucco is probably one of the older finishes in America. It probably came across with the Mayflower almost. Stucco finish has changed over the years of how it's done. A traditional stucco that you'd see on a house in Spokane maybe from 120 years ago was done a lot different than today. Back in the 1900s or 1890s, what they did was they put the walls weren't of plywood then, they were of boards, and the boards all had spaces on them. And back in those years, what you'll find is some paper on the wall, and then they typically use like a chicken wire mesh that they nailed all over the wall, and the paper and the boards. And then from there, they would use what was called the brown coat, a mixture of sand and Portland cement, and that would go over the chicken wire, and then they would just let it sit for several months because cement shrinks and it cracks out. And so still some guys use a traditional stucco. They don't use chicken wire, they use metal lap. But on the home we are on today, we're talking about more of a modern system of stucco. Talk about the modern systems of stucco. During probably the 70s, probably late 70s and 80s, some of these new systems got really a bad name. Some of those were called EFIS, and they were Drive It would be one example of that, a brand name. And those systems there, what they did was they used foam, like white styrofoam, like packing foam, like an inch thick on the wall, and then they would use a mesh over that, and then they would use these acrylic finishes. The problem with the EFIS systems is that any holes that you got in the finish of the system would let water into that white foam. And so it got to be probably in the 90s somewhere that you couldn't even find an insurance company if you went to it and you said, I'm going to be a contractor. Do you use any EFIS systems? Well, then we're not insuring you if you do. So I remember signing something saying that we wouldn't use EFIS. Today, we're using a different system. It's probably a hybrid of that, and I'll show you that here in a second. On our hybrid system here of this stucco system, what we're doing is we first built our home with zip-R panels. That's behind this material here. So the zip-R panel was also used a fluid flash membrane, and we sealed the whole house with the fluid flashing on the zip-R panel. From there, the zip-R says you don't need a house wrap on it. Behind a stucco system, I wanted to use a house wrap, but something better than that. So we use this Hydra Gap, and what this product does, it has all of these little pimples on it, which hold it off the wall. Using here for our base sheet or our scratch coat of the old days is this. It's basically cement board. So this stuff, it's used in showers. You can get it wet. It's very hard to cut. It's dense, and that's what we're using for our base. So if we're looking at this system, we're using our base, and we're using these around the windows. We use one with weep holes at the top, and on the sides of it, we're using this to finish it off. So we're going to finish the stucco to this. We're at various intervals, an expansion joint that looks like this, because when product gets too big of surfaces, you want to be able to allow it to move. So we're using this, I think, every about 15 feet or so. This also has a little protective coating on it, so once you're done, you can peel it off and it looks clean. So our next process is to seam tape all of the seams and fill them. So we use this mesh, and we go along and we fill every seam, and we dot every screw and fasten. That's the next step. Okay, from here we have our seams taped. If any of this is too rough, we use these tools to rasp it off, and that tool looks like. And believe it or not, that lasts quite a while. You'd think with just one swipe that would go away. But this can be taken and used to sand any blurbs off that you have. Once this is put on, it's mudded right behind it, so you don't see any of that mesh. And then what it's going to start looking like from there is it's going to look like this. Because after the mesh, then whatever sanding you need to do, we take and we use this primer paint, and this is kind of mixed to the color of the finish, and we paint this. This stuff is probably optional, but the reason we put a paint on here is that way, if any of the finish doesn't go on consistently, that the color will be behind the finish coated stuff. Several brands. The two probably main brands are Sto and Drive It. We're using Sto on this job. Their mesh is yellow, their buckets are yellow, so the Sto brand is yellow, so that's good to know. All right, the last step the guys, Toby and Patrick, are getting ready to do is the final finish coat. We're using a fine sand. What we're going to use is hawks and trowels, and they're going to have to get a whole panel done. You can't just stop and start. You got to do a whole panel at once.